Before we get started though, or fully started, I do want to do a land acknowledgement. And I will apologize in advance if I mispronounce, as I'm still learning how to say this. I just joined the SciCity team a little over a month ago. So I'm still learning a little bit myself. But I do want to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Shatikoke, Golden Hill, Pagosset, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquian speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. So I want to do that even though we are virtual and we're all maybe in different places. With that, I also want to introduce Tom. Tom is our speaker for the night and also going to be doing things. And he is a former engineer and entrepreneur. He's currently a junior principal at QuantumBlack and McKinsey Company. He works with organizations across all sorts of sectors, financial services, retail, healthcare, and helps them adopt and unlock value from new technologies such as artificial intelligence and blockchain. Prior to that, Tom was the co-founder and CTO of Commandiv, a FinTech startup based in New York. He currently is living in New Haven and is originally from West Haven. So, Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And thank you everyone for taking the time to be here. Looking forward to engaging discussion. Before I kick it off, I do have slides, and I can kind of go into the content. Would love if we could just use the chat for a bit where, I don't think we have enough time to go around each person individually, but it'd be great if, it would be great to kind of understand where people are on their journey, the journey of entrepreneurship. Is this kind of something that you're curious about? Have you have an idea, or you already started working on something? And secondly, the second question would be, what would be most helpful for you in this part of the journey? And I can try to weave some of that stuff in as appropriate. So why don't we take two minutes? So first question: where are you on the journey of entrepreneurship, from curious to wherever? And then second, what would be most helpful? That would be really helpful for me to just understand. So I'll just take 2 minutes to give people time.
Do we just talk?
If you could put it in the chat, yeah. If you could just put it in the chat function, and that way I can kind of hear from everyone at a high level. Okay, I'll just read some of the stuff off. Feel free to continue. So early stage, building a social impact company. Curious, have some ideas, would like to know how to gather and motivate a team. Okay, we'll talk about that. Supporting a food startup under SciCity as part of my listening to customer course. Founder, early stage startup, menstrual hygiene product, but would love to start my own. Just starting to explore option, interest in FinTech, blockchain, AI, data analytics. We will unpack all of the buzzwords today, by the way, so not to worry. Near the end of the journey, advising startups and simply looking to hear about any apps, approaches that you've all found useful. Innovation program manager at a global logistics company, wanted to learn about innovation best practices. Cool. LLC to market and distribute a healthcare innovation system, early stage seeking grant and seed funding. This is great. I love the variety here. early stage veteran mental health app. I'm just reading through. This is great. And you know, like I don't know about for everyone here, but for me, these events are also about kind of getting to know other people that are interested in the same thing. So I hope that you all do take the opportunity to kind of connect offline as well. So I will try to touch upon some of these things. Some of the topics are indeed part of the content I have prepared. Some of them are may or may not be overlapping. But like I said, I'd like this to be a, you know, an engaging discussion where we can kind of learn from each other and share. And I would say if anyone does have any questions throughout, feel free to use the raise hand functionality. So if you just go to participants, you should see a button to raise hands. I can see that. And then we can pause that or just unmute and feel free to chime in. It will also have questions at the end. So in terms of what I will be presenting, before I jump right in, really it's three things. It's the why, the how, and then the what. So the why is technology fluency important? The how is what are some patterns to get there, depending on the need and necessity. And then the what is, you know, what, like we talked about, unpacking some of the buzzwords around technology, whether it's AI or, you know, blockchain, FinTech, etc. And then I'll make sure to leave some time for questions as well. And if we don't have time for questions, I would say feel free to reach out to me as well. Okay, let's jump in. First, I should probably introduce myself. So as Matthew mentioned, I'm a junior principal at QuantumBlack. So QuantumBlack is a specifically focused on AI and, you know, advanced analytics, large scale implementation and transformation, as well as, you know, strategy as well. And we work across all industries. Interestingly, the company started in Formula One in the UK. About 5 years ago, was acquired by McKinsey Company. You know, you may have heard McKinsey Company is a, you know, global management consulting firm focused on top level strategy for all types of organizations. And, you know, within that context, I kind of serve this role as working with teams as a, you know, an operator, but also helping to lead cross-functional teams in developing AI solutions and developing AI strategy. Before going into consulting, I was in the startup scene. I was both a lead engineer and I had my own startup for a little bit. I'm very passionate about entrepreneurship in general. And so I also act as an advisor to some early stage companies as well. And my fun fact, I used to teach Sanskrit in India. So if someone is interested in that, I can have another session because it's a long story. Cool. All right. So as I mentioned, QuantumBlack focused specifically on advanced analytics and AI, and, you know, started in Formula One. Now we work across all type of industries, and the main thing is really about, you know, it's really about these transformations of going into an organization where they haven't really unlocked value in artificial intelligence and finding how throughout the whole organization we can have impact. Okay, so why? Let me come to the why now. Why is technology fluency important? This is and I'll, some of this stuff should be fairly obvious. I can kind of breeze over it, but essentially, I think a lot of us here know the trends in technology. Essentially, no matter what service or product you may be looking to, to develop, the odds are is that it's gonna, have something to do with technology in some way. And that is the case even if it's not a technology product or service. If it is in retail, um, if it is in hospitality, et cetera, like even in the retail space where you're selling um, a product that is to be consumed. I'm thinking of like edible goods and stuff like that. There's so much intersection with technology nowadays in terms of going to market and advertising, to how you manage your supply chains and operations as well, to just having kind of brand awareness, etc. So I mean, these are just some of the trends. We can see that more and more of our lives are connected to the internet, which is why products and services have to deal with technology. We see that a lot of early stage funding goes to technology startups, about 73%. And so that's kind of the, why you kind of have to pay attention to it and just have a general understanding. But I think there's a second side to it, which is the opportunity that's there. I think there's a huge opportunity. We can see $300 billion of expected revenue from new technologies in 2025. And this comes from new technologies such as AI, artificial intelligence, blockchain, et cetera. And we'll get into what some of those opportunities are, but there's a lot of potential, and so this is where a lot of investment money is, and for startups, but also where a lot of the impact is potentially as well. And one thing too, you don't have to, but I would ask, if you're fully engaged, if you could turn on your video so I can have the feel at least of it being a live audience. I know it's annoying. I'm a student myself, but it certainly helps to gauge the reactions. Okay, so technology fluency. This is the topic that I was asked to talk about. And I think the angle is you want to create a startup or a new venture. You don't come from a technical or software engineering background. What does that mean? Like, what type of skills do you need to develop, or what type of understanding do you need to develop? And so this is my own definition, my own perspective. One, technology fluency is not about using jargon or lingo. It's not about throwing words about blockchain or AI, et cetera, into describing your product when there's not really substance there. And just to be totally frank, this is something that as a startup founder myself, I would see constantly in investor pitches and competitions of somehow try to spin the product. And it might be a very good product. Not all products need to have AI. That's just ridiculous, right? And so having kind of the integrity of saying what the product is, and not thinking that you have to kind of dress up a product in these kind of buzzword technologies. What I do think fluency is, though, and that's one side of it, is not misrepresenting or feeling like the only good ideas have these buzzword technologies. That's not true. There's a lot of innovation that is outside of technology. I do think that fluency is, I call it understanding the art of the possible. And this is something that is difficult, right? It's understanding the art of the possible. It's understanding what are the limitations as well. So what can technology do? What the current state of technology, what can it do? What is it good at? 5 years or so, where do we think we'll be good? that type of understanding can be really helpful, especially when you're thinking about competitive differentiation and like understanding where the market is going. So that's one aspect of it. And I think that's related to what I mentioned in terms of the why is understanding the opportunity, right? So understanding the art of the possible is kind of understanding the opportunity. If you understand where the technology is going and what's possible, you can kind of tap into what some of those opportunities are. But then when the rubber hits the road and you need to implement something, there's a second part of technology fluency, which is being able to work with a technical team, right? All of you, or many of you will go on to start businesses and have technical team members. And it can be frustrating on both sides of that equation when there's not an understanding of what goes into the technical product building. And so I think both of these things are important. Both of these things do not come in a 1-hour session, right? But what we can talk about are what are some avenues to develop those skills. Let me pause there. Any questions so far? Does this make sense? Yeah. Okay. So in preparation for this, I thought about, okay, what are some of the options available for startup founders? And this is kind of back of the envelope kind of thinking, but essentially in my limited experience, I see a couple different paradigms take shape. So one is that you can just ignore technology, and I put that it is uncommon, but it's not that it's not possible. Like you can totally have a startup in certain industries or type of products where you don't have to learn anything about technology. I think about since this is Yale and Barry Nailbuff with Honest Tea, I doubt that he had a very deep understanding of technology in creating Honest Tea, right? Maybe if they were to come up with it now, maybe they would need to have something for the marketing, et cetera. But there's certainly innovation in products where you don't need to be very deep in technology. Let me just check the chat. So that's kind of one paradigm. And the flip side of that is, what I mentioned in the first slide, which is the why technology is important. This can come and bite you later on if you don't understand where the market is moving. And we see this in retail goods, absolutely. So if you look at how a lot of spaces in retail have been disrupted from the supply chain aspects to marketing. Think of like Harry's razors. I'm not sure if anyone remembers whether it was Unilever or Procter & Gamble who acquired them for more than $1 billion. And it's what the main innovation was. They marketed in a different way using different online channels. They had kind of a different type of subscription model. They sourced materials in a way that was very light, right? So they outsourced materials in the production process. So that's an example of a product that, because they saw kind of what the art of the possible was in some of these innovative ways of marketing and production, they were able to capitalize on that. And that's a non-technology service or product, right? So even more, I think any space, I think it's generally wise to have a minimal amount of technology fluency. The second one, and I'll give some examples of this, is to outsource, right? So you fully recognize that your skill is not in technology, right? You're amazing at creating brand awareness or marketing, or you just have the insight of this product. This is just not your thing. And so you want to capitalize on where your strengths are. And so therefore, as a founding team without any technical founding members, you outsource all the technology development. I put this as this number 2, right? So level of understanding, I think you still need some understanding to do this. You don't need to have a computer science degree, of course. Like, you don't have to be an expert in that field, but if you're going to be outsourcing, you still need to do the quality assurance. You still need to understand the partners that you're getting involved with, and that's actually surprisingly difficult. So you at least need to surround yourself with people that get it, and then can act as kind of a vetting process. And there are examples of this, even in technology companies. So I give the example of Stash Invest. Has anyone ever used the mobile app Stash? It's an investing. It's like an app for investing money, where basically it will take the loose change from your purchases and then invest that for you, and then does that on a monthly basis. I think Stash is valued at, oh my goodness, I know I want to say it's over $500 million. Like, they're a private company, but they're valued pretty high. In the founding team, who I actually, I got to know one of the founders in my time in New York, that this was their strategy. He came from a consulting background. He understood where the market was going. They all had very good, I would say, operational knowledge and skills, but they didn't want to build the app, and so they kind of outsourced that part. We'll get to the pros and cons of that approach, but again, I would say there are some considerations there. Okay, the third one, I put find a technical partner. And I think that this is, maybe I'm exaggerating here, putting it as the most common, but I think for technology startups, this seems to be the most common. And, a academic environment like Yale is actually a great place for this. But just in general, there are other ways of doing this as well. This is, I worked with a company, one of my first engineering jobs, the founding team, both of them met at Columbia University. One was in the business school, the other was doing a PhD in natural language processing. And, at least Columbia, they had these, programs where you can work on hackathons and things like that. This also seems to be a fairly frequent thing if you look at a lot of the Silicon Valley tech startups. Again, I've not done any statistical analysis. This is just based on my own anecdotal observations. But it certainly is a path, and that I think is, according to some, very respected figures especially in tech startups. So those who aren't aware, Paul Graham is one of the founders of a tech startup incubator called Y Combinator, and he's written about this too, where they kind of see this as the ideal paradigm, where you have a technical founder as well as a more business focused founder. So we'll get into that. And then the last thing is, I think that this is becoming more and more a much more easy to do thing, which is to build the skills yourself. And let me just kind of reflect on that myself. I don't have a computer science degree. I went to a non-accredited coding boot camp to learn how to code. And what I will say is this: it's getting easier and easier to learn how to code. I think even 5 to 7 years ago, a lot of the main programming languages were very verbose and quite difficult to understand. And you've had a major shift both in online education for learning how to code. So think of Coursera and Code Academy, and we'll get into some of those things. But also just the libraries and programming languages themselves have gotten more eloquent and easy to understand. So for anyone who is interested, I would say it's certainly worth exploring. So this is I have a slide for each of these ones where I get into each of the pathways, but would love to hear people's reactions. Does this resonate, or any thoughts? I'm just curious in the chat or whatever, which of these do you think would fit your own journey? Just on first reactions. I mean, you can annotate it or use the chat. Three outsource. A lot of people are looking for technical co-founders. They're in very high demand. True. Okay. Well, why don't we jump through 1 and 2, and we'll spend some more time on 3 and 4. Okay. So actually, no, I think I'm going backwards. So like I said, I'm getting an echo from someone. So like I said, this is more on the number 4. I know 1 or 2 people mentioned that they might be interested in 4. My own story, I did not have a computer science background. I studied music. I actually grew up in the area. I studied piano at the ECA, which is on Audubon Street. And then like I said, I ended up living in India for 9 years, learning Sanskrit. None of these skills I actually use in my job today. They make me an interesting person. And I'm very glad that I did them, but they're not directly transferable skills. And so what I did, I went to a coding boot camp, and I'm just giving this as an example. I don't think that there's anything special about a coding boot camp that you can't find online. And I taught myself in about 9 months how to code. And then I went into the field as an engineer. And then about 3 years later, like I said, the demand for technical co-founders is so large. I was able to find my co-founder at the time, who was on the business side, and I became the CTO. And so about 3 years later, I was, co-founding a startup. And for me, let me see, I think I have some takeaways. So if you want to, if that's the direction you want to go, which is you want to develop the skills yourself, the things that I learned are, if you have an idea that you're passionate about, and it sounds like most of the people here have already started having ideas, that is the best jumping off point to learning something in technology, because you actually have an outcome, right? And I find this is the same thing in languages. Like, like I said, I taught Sanskrit. I learned several languages. And if you're just learning from a book of this is a cat, this is a boy, this is a car, I don't think that type of learning is particularly effective. But if you're put in a situation where you need to get from point A to point B, or you just need to do your job and you need to speak a language, you will learn it very fast. And so the same situation of, you have an idea, you have this passionate desire to achieve this idea. Don't think that you're beholden to other people to develop the idea. I think that drive and that passion itself is the greatest spark for learning something that you can directly apply, right? You don't need to learn everything. Just learn the things that you need to do, learn the things that you need to know to actually make that idea a reality. And this is the approach that I took when I was learning. I was very passionate about this language learning online application that would pair different language learners of different languages, et cetera. And, I through the process, I learned so much about building apps and, all types of things, that if I were just trying to learn about these things in a generic way, I would not have gotten very far. So that's one thing. The other thing that everyone should know about the technology community is that it is very open. And this will take people completely by shock and surprise, that you can reach out to someone without an introduction and just say, hey, I saw your profile, I think it's really cool that you're doing this. I'm talking about founders of startups, and say, I would love to get coffee and talk more about it, and get, hear, how you did it. And it is shocking how open the community is, and like willing to provide advice and, stuff like that. And you just have to be, you just can't have any shame, really. Like, you just have to be willing to reach out and ask people, and you'd be shocked at how much people are willing to help. There are tons of resources. As I said, there's a big push in the United States in general to have more people have coding as a fluency. I think the number of software engineering jobs is, I think it's like 20% more than the actual number of software engineers. And so because of this, there's a lot of resources. In the last 5 years, a ton of stuff has come about that makes it very easy to learn. So that's another thing. And then the last thing, this kind of goes back to the community piece, but it's really just about talking to people, getting asking questions to people, going to meetups or different events, asking questions and understanding the lay of the land, so you know where to focus. So that's kind of on number 4. I should have numbered these accurately. It's bothering me now. The next one is number 3. So a lot of people mention finding a technical co-founder. That's something they're interested in doing. This is a great, like I said, this is a very common path that happens. So after I did the boot camp and learned how to code, I ended up working for these 2 guys, Sage and Mohammed. They have a startup, Agolo. Now they're doing very well. This is several years later now. They've raised money from, I think Microsoft has become an investor. I think Google invested as well. I don't know the exact, amount, but needless to say, they're doing very well. It's an AI startup. And, they met, Sage was doing his MBA at Columbia, and Mohammed was in a PhD program. And, they found that they liked each other, and that they, collaborated on some ideas. The ideas that they initially had are nothing close to what they ended up actually doing. And so I came a little bit after that phase, once they had gone through several different ideas, and one idea after another didn't work. But they did find something that stuck with the help from, advisors and an accelerator and everything. So, this is certainly an option. I think it's just a matter of getting out there and trying to build your network, going to events. And so going to like hackathons in particular are great places where you can kind of contribute from the idea. Like, even if you have no technical skills, hackathons are great because they do involve this, what is the idea that we're solving? What's our strategy, etc. And it gives you an opportunity to meet other technical people that could blossom into, something further. So I would say, try to explore different events. A lot of times it's word of mouth. And in my example, for example, I was working here at Agolo as an engineer, and I met someone for coffee. They had a friend that was looking for a technical co-founder, and that person made an introduction. So I think a lot of times it does happen in that way of yeah, I think you have to build a reputation for yourself a little bit first, so that you know, so I wouldn't wait until you find a technical co-founder. Like, go to hackathons, participate in things, you know, build a bit of a reputation for being active in the space, and try to you know, I think through the network is how a lot of people meet people. Outsourcing, just briefly, like I said, it is possible. It's the cons are that it's expensive, right? So if you like, this app is a beautiful app if if you use it. That's not something you'll get on what is it, Upwork for $100 a day. It can be expensive if you want to go the outsourcing route, and also there's a high element of quality assurance. And so I think because of this, it's much more rarer, in at least in technology startups, to go the route of outsourcing. But there are cases where it has been done successfully. So I did want to call that out. And here we go. So, I think to close this part of it, which is the how, we come back to the original thing. What is the art of the possible? What is the where is the market going, and how is that influenced by changes in technology? I think this is super important because and just to go back to my own experience as a startup founder, I was on the technical side. So I was the CTO and co-founder. My partner was the CEO. He was the one that had the original business idea. And the space we were in was in the wealth management. So think somewhere in between a Robinhood and a Betterment, active and passive investing in the same app. And what was awakening, what was like a kind of like a light bulb moment for me, was at the end of it, I was ultimately responsible for the technology. The technology is not why we didn't succeed, right? It was ultimately because of the strategy. And I think that's why I really enjoy what I do now, working with McKinsey Company, working with organizations on strategy. And part of that strategy is understanding where the market is going, what are the market dynamics in the space. And so part of that is understanding what's the art of the possible for technology. So here are some, just a couple resources that I have found helpful. On Coursera, Andrew Ng has a series of courses on artificial intelligence that are very good. Podcasts, anything with Y Combinator, including the founders, Paul Graham and Sam Altman, is very helpful. And then these are just some classic books on innovation and just the kind of like the challenges of technical product development. So yeah, that is kind of the gist of what I would say are the options available. I've prepared a couple slides on, specific trends on, the work I do is very closely, is particularly focused on AI. So I, happy to give an overview of where that space is going. But let me pause here and would love to hear if anyone has any specific questions. Do you guys find this as helpful? No.
So I actually had a question about you mentioned that you went to like a coding boot camp. Like, are there any specific resources that you would recommend for maybe like just like learning how to code apps, like very intro level type stuff? What would be you would say like the best bang for your buck, like, best quality education for lowest possible price?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I have to kind of caveat my answer. I can certainly give you what I think it is, but I would say also that that the landscape is changing, right? So there's every 6 months or so, a new framework or library will come into vogue, and will kind of be where be kind of the new answer, right? So I can give kind of my view on, you know, app development. It's not something I'm as involved in now, but I think at least in app development, because that's your specific question, there's been a lot of trend towards how do you simplify the process of making apps without sacrificing some of the quality. So for example, if you're an app developer, I have a couple apps on the App Store from when I was making like mobile apps and stuff. But if you're an app developer, you have to have it on, you know, iPhone, and you have to have it on Android devices, right? And these are two separate programming languages. So iPhone is in, I think it's Swift is the language now. I think it used to be Objective-C, and then for Android it's in Java. So right there, it's like, what are you going to have? Two separate people to code these applications for you? Well, I think in the last, like, I don't know, 3 to 5 years, they started introducing some frameworks that make it a little bit easier using a single programming language. And I think all of these are in JavaScript. So if you are interested in mobile apps or in web apps, I think JavaScript is a very valuable language because it's the language of the web browser. And so anything that you do that involves, like, if you go to like Airbnb's website and like there's you can just go to like Berkshire Hathaway's homepage. Their website is from 1995, and then look at a modern day website and see how interactive it is, right? You know, old web pages, it used to be like you click a link and then the whole page refreshes. Now you have all this series of interactions, and that's all possible through JavaScript. So what a lot of the app development community has done is taken JavaScript as a language and say, we want to be able to build mobile apps in iOS and Android with JavaScript. And so there are a couple different frameworks for this, but the root of it is JavaScript. The trade-off, of course, is, well, is the quality as good because you're kind of building a, you know, a wrapper around what's happening in the actual app. But I think that in the early stage, my opinion would be that that's less of a consideration. So for app development, definitely check out, I would look up, you know, JavaScript frameworks for building apps. I've built several in this way and made some money off of it too. It's certainly possible, and you don't need to, you know, a single person can do it, as opposed to, you know, having a separate developer for one and for another. That makes sense? Anyone else?
Hey, Tom, there's two in the chat. I don't know if you saw those or not.
Okay, yeah, just seeing it now. So what consideration for non-techies in terms of how to test and demonstrate feasibility? Interesting. Could you say more about that, Heidi?
Yes, hi.
Hi.
All right, I had to unmute. Yeah, so we have a system that has some data sources, and it goes through data processing and then reports. We've actually done some initial testing on the algorithms, and it's related to healthcare and medical care of people with intellectual disabilities. And the initial results were off the charts. So in terms of the helpfulness of the algorithms, and we are engaging a developer, so we're outsourcing our technology, and we're also applying for grants. And one of the things that we're sort of struggling with is in terms of study design with respect to the grants in terms of next steps before we create a minimum viable product. What are the things that we should be considering in terms of feasibility, usability? You know, I'm trying to get up to speed and read all these articles. And,
Yeah, absolutely.
So just, you know, from a high level, it would be helpful to understand kind of what the sort of normal quote next step would be from a tech perspective.
Yeah, I would think of it. So the way I think about that is kind of in two different ways. So one, if I just take a step back, in terms of like testing and stuff like that, if I think about something that's not data science related, you would just use kind of assertions or unit tests. It's almost similar to how you would check an Excel spreadsheet. That's kind of a very simple case. Once you start getting into like AI models or, you know, applied data science, it becomes a lot more complicated. And at that point, what I would start looking into is, you know, there's a lot of stuff written on explainability. And so, for example, if you have a model, you know, normal regressions will have kind of like what are the features and what are the, you know, what are the factors that go into it. With an AI model, you have to go a little bit deeper and get into, we call it the feature importances. I think I can't go in detail. Go ahead. So feature importances would be, you know, it's in a way AI models are very similar to just doing a regression. It's, you know, you have X and Y, you know, you have a series of variables and you're trying to predict Y. The difference is that they're not as explainable as, you know, as regressions. And so there are libraries and techniques to actually draw out of the variables that were used, what is the importance of each variable. And so that's kind of a first step, is understanding what are the variables that are being used to make a decision. And I know you mentioned kind of in the healthcare space, so it's very important to understand that, right? And so understanding, without going too much into the detail, we can follow up too, and happy to provide some links. But it's getting to an understanding of what the model is doing, which is honestly, it's in a topic that is still being very actively explored in academia. But there is stuff out there to help provide some level of explainability.
Oh, okay, fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, next question. I would love to hear your thoughts on where AI is going. Great, because I have some slides for that. What are the best information resources to keep up on tech trends? What are the free best resources for the non-techs to keep up? What languages will we need to know for the Web 3.0, the spatial web? I'm not sure what the spatial web is. So, Selena, maybe you could help me understand. Do you mean like AR? And I think you're on mute.
Thanks so much. Yeah, just thinking about how sort of, if I think of Web 1, it was sort of text transfer, and then Web 2, you know, was more multi-dimensional, obviously having, and then Web 3 is more smart cities and, you know, sort of interactive, if you will, yeah, 3-dimensional.
Got it. So kind of the Internet of Things.
And smart cities and self-automated cars, all that.
So not to be selfish, but we publish a lot of thought leadership on McKinsey.com. We have an app called McKinsey Insights, and you can choose the specific areas that you want to be informed about. And there's actually a ton of research that we're doing, particularly now around COVID and technology. So, you know, using models to predict the flow, you know, the future exposure of COVID. But we have done a lot on smart cities and just in general trends and technologies. I think that would be a really good place to start. There are some kind of, I guess you would call like influencers on technology. So I listed Andreessen Horowitz is a VC firm that's been very active in this space, and so you can look them up and find some of their partners who invest in technology startups. I mean, the thing with VCs that is very interesting is that they have to be on the cutting edge. They have to understand what the cutting edge in technology is because that's their job. And they're also incentivized to write about it a lot because they want to get their own kind of name brand recognition out there. So you'll find if you just look up tech VCs like Andreessen Horowitz, and you can learn a lot about kind of what are some of the trends. So that would be my recommendation for that. And then languages, I think, when I think of web and web development, I like I said, JavaScript is really big. In the AI space, certainly I am using Python almost exclusively. Python has become much more broadly used in AI, and it's also, I would say it's a more elegant language than, I don't know, elegant sounds too judgmental. It's a more simpler language than a lot of the more verbose languages. So Python is becoming more and more used in the space of AI. So let me quickly, I know someone asked about where, you also asked, where AI is going. I have a few slides on both blockchain and AI. I've done work on both, and so I can kind of share some top of the mountain views in terms of what are the implications. Does that sound good? Cool. All right, so blockchain. My startup that I co-founded, we did not start as a blockchain company, but we ended up as a blockchain company. Interestingly, we were in the wealth management space, and we were one of the early investment advisors to incorporate cryptocurrencies, and so that actually for me sparked a lot of research myself into Bitcoin and blockchain at the time. And I ended up I've done some consulting on blockchain as well. Basically what it is, it's using cryptography. It's just math behind the scenes of basically I can sign something. I can prove that I signed it, but nobody else can know that I signed it. And that type of cryptography, what it allows you to do, allows you to basically have a ledger of transaction where people are signing them, and that you can verify ownership, but it's still anonymous. That's really the core innovation out of it. And so what we've seen at potential applications, distributed computing. So normally a database belongs to an individual or organization. The difference between that and blockchain is that you can have a database that is essentially not owned by one person, but it's owned by a collective of computers, right? That's essentially what it is. So Bitcoin, there's no Bitcoin company that is running that owns the Bitcoin database. Anyone owns it. You can download the Bitcoin software, run it on your local laptop, and then you become a part of this interconnected web of computation. And so, I think blockchain went through its phase of a lot of hype and excitement, and it's died down a little bit. But I think there are still some interesting applications, and we're still seeing some, mainly in the area of finance. But you're also seeing some things in the supply chain as well. So when you need to coordinate shipping logistics, or between multiple parties, and you want to create like a decentralized transaction log, there are a couple of companies that are, at the very least, experimenting with this at a pretty broad scale. Okay, AI. What is AI? I know we have 3 minutes, so I will make this. I'll make this fast. AI essentially is you use training and inference. The way I would define AI is, mimicking human mimicking human behavior, whether cognitive or physical, right? So Essentially, whether it's speech or vision or analysis, you're trying to mimic behavior. The way that you do that is by training. And so you can see you're feeding the picture of the cat. The model is able to learn from it, and then you're able to do inference on new data. Artificial intelligence is kind of a blanket term. You have lots of different techniques within it, such as machine learning, deep learning, etc. And we've seen some huge leaps and bounds in the last 10 years in terms of this advancement. So a couple of reasons why AI is becoming such a big thing now. The algorithms have greatly improved. So you can see the error rate on the left side. It used to be that human error rates were better than AI, and that has switched in the last 5 years with deep learning. This is for image classification. And the hardware there's been a lot of advancement in terms of ways to actually train using distributed computing, as well as different types of hardware components that make the training happen at a much faster speed. So you can see 60 times faster for training as opposed to 2013. And then the last thing, there's just a lot more data. You mentioned, Internet of Things and, the collection of all types of sensors, all this kind of stuff. About 80% of the world's data was produced in the last few years. So just quickly, AI is being used very broadly. It's not just tech companies. It's being used by, as I mentioned, retail space, agriculture, you name it. And we have, I'll send this link out. There's a huge economic opportunity and a huge opportunity, where is it? For social impact as well. So I can send out some, Matthew, maybe I can send some links. And I think we can share the slides possibly later. Let me check, but yeah, that's about it. I hope this has given a little bit of an overview of ways to improve fluency and kind of what's out there. And I'm happy to stay on if anyone has other questions, but don't want to hold anyone up.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, for all this. This is awesome. No, thanks for doing this. I even learned some things too, which is sweet. Yeah, and we can stick around too for questions, especially if Tom gets some time. So, yeah,
absolutely.
And also, side note, also we'd love your feedback too on like events and things like that. So Ellen's been dropping the link in the chat. So if you could do that before you leave, that would be super, super helpful because we are planning for the spring. And we do want to make sure we're building out or have workshops that are actually helpful. So yeah, thanks for coming, everyone. We're so happy that you're here.